Ivy and Gecko acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Welcome to Hearts and Minds. Our podcast episodes feature conversations with highly accomplished mining executives and board directors. We'll explore critical themes relating to leadership impact, staff engagement and culture development. So tune in, enjoy the conversations and prepare to be inspired. I'm Alana Bray-White, the Managing Director of Ivy and Gecko, and this is our podcast, Hearts and Minds.
If you get the right people, the right culture, they will establish for the business they're in and the assets they have, the right strategy over time. And I would have said the other way around. I said, get the assets, have the right strategy, and then find the people to do the work. But I'm increasingly of the view that you have to have the right people first. So I think that bad behaviour is in no way confined to the mining industry. I think, unfortunately, inappropriate executive behaviour and inappropriate oversight by boards is a problem that crops up in every industry. And I don't think it's any more prevalent in mining than any other.
Our guest today is Dave Kelly, an internationally experienced geologist, mining executive and company director. Dave has gained over 35 years' experience in exploration, operations management, business development and project evaluation and finance. He is currently the non-executive chair of Lefroy Exploration, a WA-focused gold and nickel explorer, and a non-executive director for West Gold Resources, a leading mid-tier gold producer. The Ivy and Gecko team has known Dave for a number of years now and always found him to be a source of wisdom and dry humour. I enjoyed the breadth of this conversation as Dave expresses his conviction that we need to get the right people sitting in the right seats on the bus before we drive away. He goes on to talk about the quality of governance shown by Australian mining boards and the current state of diversity within the executive leadership teams. We discuss sovereign risk considerations for investors, not only in African jurisdictions, but in Australia also. And on a lighter note, we learn that Dave is an avid fiction reader, and he offers an interesting choice of book for his most valuable non-fiction read. I hope you enjoy our chat with Dave Kelly. Thanks for tuning in.
Dave, thanks for joining us in the studio today.
My pleasure.
We've known each other for a number of years, and I always come away from our conversations with some new insights, so I do appreciate you spending the time with us. As you know, this podcast is all about leadership effectiveness and the impact it has on engagement with stakeholders and development of culture within the mining business context. So really keen to get your thoughts on those themes. But before we do, and as we usually do with our guests, let's learn a little bit about your background, Dave. Tell us about your early childhood years.
Well, I grew up in Wellington in New Zealand. Okay. And so it's a million miles away, not a million miles away, but geographically, culturally, it's a bit different from the mining industry of Western Australia, where I eventually found myself. So my father was a teacher's college lecturer. Prior to that, he was a school teacher. So he had a lot of time off on holidays. So he tended to look after us a fair bit and take us to places that ordinarily maybe we wouldn't go.
Cool.
And my mother was actually quite the opposite. She was a scientist. She was an electronics engineer.
Wow.
She was the only female electronics engineer in New Zealand. If you can imagine, it's a small place at the time that she...
With a major company, Dave?
She worked for the New Zealand government, the post office. So she actually did things like designing microwave communication systems. And she won a Fulbright scholarship to the US, to the MIT in Boston. So she's the scientist in the family rather than my father. But my dad was what's the word? I think you'd either call him a dilettante or a jack of all trades, but my father knew something about everything. He was the scourge of the pub quiz nights in Wellington, to the point where he was banned from attending. So I think I got a lot of influence from both my parents. Yeah. And Wellington was a fun place to grow up in because it's a capital city, and so you have all the amenities and activities of a small capital, and it's about the size of Canberra. But it's a really interesting geographic location, the bottom of the South Island. It's really rugged, steep hills. Every valley is in fact an active fault. And that sort of engendered some interest in geology, and that's where I wound up.
Well, it's a lovely place, New Zealand. I've been there a few times. Interestingly, I always think of Auckland as being the capital city of New Zealand.
That's a common mistake, and one that I won't admonish you for, David, but... yes, and it's a bit like most people think Sydney's the important city in Australia.
Correct.
In fact, ultimately Canberra is.
Yeah.
But unlike Canberra, Wellington has a reason for existence. Otherwise, it's a port and it's in the centre of the country and it's a transport hub. But it's also an interesting place to live because the weather is frankly pretty capricious. And a lot of people absolutely hate the place because, it's not a place. If you like balmy sunshine 9 months of the year, that's not Wellington.
Yeah. And siblings, Dave?
I have 3 in all, so they all live in Wellington, within probably 5 kilometres of where my parents used to live. So it's quite a small place geographically.
Yeah. And what were your early interests?
Well, I think like most people in my generation, I followed the rugby. I played cricket and rugby, not to any great standard. And I was always interested in sort of history and a whole range of activities. And I think that's one of the things I inherited my father, who is a bit of, was a bit of a Renaissance man, He was into classical music and opera and literature, but also loved going to the rugby with his mates and spent half his life in a pub. And I think we're all a bit the same as my siblings, my brothers.
Yeah, it's an interesting mix of arts and science in your parents. What were your favourite subjects and least favourite subjects at high school?
Well, an odd eclectic mix again. I was quite good at sciences and maths, but I really didn't want to do the hard maths. And I was good at history and written English. But I actually drifted away from, I suppose, the pure arts side and more into the science, I think, because I also had that sort of interest in logic and the scientific method, I suppose. So I'm a bit of an odd mix, I think, David.
I know you've had a experience in both mining operator companies as well as advisory firms. How do you compare the value of the experience you gained from those different types of organisations?
Oh, look, I think they're both immensely useful to me personally, and I think to be a good advisor, it's essential that you've worked an extensive period of time in the business that you're proposing to advise people upon. It seems obvious, right? Similarly, if you want to work in an industry, it's really useful to have been in an advisory or a financing business, which I was also involved in, because you see so many operations and you see so much success and so much lack of success that you understand, I think, intuitively after those exposures, what works and perhaps what doesn't work. So I think it's a great mix, and I was fortunate to have done both in the early part of my career. So it means I'm equipped to do a bit of both now.
Yeah, I'm sure the experience and insight you gain from the consulting side of the marketplace is of great value when you're sitting on boards of mining companies for that reason.
It is, yeah. I think because it does broaden your perspective of what's out there, but also how things can be done and how things can be done badly.
When you're not concentrating on your work, Dave, how do you relax? It sounds like you might be following the rugby somewhat.
A little bit, although not as much as I used to. I read a lot. I do a bit of exercise, the bare minimum to keep myself, still mobile.
Yeah.
I have a whole lot of little hobbies without being sort of dedicated to anything. I think that's probably, an extension of my tendency to have a lot of interest, but no overriding one. I'm trying to learn how to play golf belatedly, and to be honest, it's a struggle that I'm not yet claiming victory over. But people say it's a lifelong effort.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, look, I've tried and given up and tried and given up, but I haven't sustained my golfing habits. But you've got the right build, tall, long-limbed.
Yes, but, it's about hand-eye coordination, and sometimes that's not my strong suit. I do also do a bit of cycling, so I'm sort of part of that dreadful group of middle-aged blokes that hang around cafes.
Cop abuse from me as I drive around Wembley.
Rightly so.
Let's talk about leadership, Dave. What does leadership mean to you?
Well, it's funny enough, I think leadership more as a one of the led than one of the leaders often. And I think like any customer experience, it's about how it affects you. And everyone has their own perception of what a leader looks like. I think there are so many styles and so many means, but I think in the end it comes down to some degree of authenticity and people believing over a long period of time what you tell them and you're acting in a manner consistent with what you tell them. And I don't think there's any one particular personality type or approach that's successful. In fact, I was thinking about this prior to the discussion. There was a guy who was my supervisor at university and he was a very quiet man. Very good in his field. He was, a round expert, but he had this quiet authority, and he didn't shout at anyone. He didn't really have to say anything much, and he was quite a diffident, quiet guy, but he had exuded authority.
Yes.
I often think that's a leadership model I admire, where people don't have to do anything much, but they clearly command respect, and people tend to see them as genuine.
Yeah, you raise a very good point. There are many different styles of leadership, and you don't need to be a song and dance man, do you, to be effective? You talked, I think, about authenticity there, and I always think that credibility and reliability and an empathy for another person's point of view are the pillars, the foundations of good leadership, because if you demonstrate those qualities, people tend to respect you. You earn their trust. And without that, of course, it's difficult to be influential as a leader.
Correct. And I think the corollary of that is that if you don't behave in a manner that's consistent with the way you expect others to, or, in the manner which you've led people to believe is your value set, then you lose credibility very quickly, and it's almost impossible to regain. So I think you're almost better to, as in many things in life, under-promise and over-deliver.
Dave, I'll be interested in your perspective on this. I know you've gained experience in the past with mining operations in West Africa. A lot of people, of course, particularly in Australia, have an inspire and empower approach to leading people. Is it the case in Africa and possibly other overseas jurisdictions that the command and control approach to leadership, is there a place still in those communities for that style of leadership?
Look, I think everything has to be, culturally appropriate, and the degree to which you can impose a command and control culture in a Western country is diminished as sort of hierarchies and expectations of adherence to a hierarchy have broken down. I think when you go to Africa, one of the things you notice that there is and there remains a very differential culture to people who are in authority. So whether that's for someone like me as an expatriate manager, or whether for it's a senior person in their society, it is still very much a culture that respects hierarchy and authority, rightly or wrongly. But I don't think that requires you to still behave in a sort of, dictatorial manner.
Yes.
One of the things that had always been the case for as long as I think anyone's been operating in Africa had been a tendency for people to bring in expat management. So most of the senior management, superintendents, general managers were always expatriates. And one of the things we did was to appoint First Malian to be the managing director of our business and to run the asset at Siama. So that gives people, I think, the understanding that if they acquire the experience and the qualifications and obviously have the right aptitude, and the particular individual involved is enormously able, then they can aspire to those positions, and I think that's really important. Plus, in the end of the day, it's not sustainable for us to send an endless rotating array of expats to run the assets. It doesn't make sense. You wouldn't do it here.
No, that's right. And I think the fundamental problem of a dictatorial style of leadership is that you tend to surround yourself with people that think like you and give you the answers that you want to hear. Yeah. So you really establish an echo chamber.
That's probably true.
People don't feel safe to challenge and offer constructive criticism of what a leader is thinking and saying. And we see that all over the world, don't we, with some political leaders.
Well, you establish a groupthink amongst that leadership team who, as you say, have a tendency to operate similarly. And that does mean that if there are alternative approaches, then they tend not to get much of an airing.
I read quite a few leadership-related books, and I picked up the old favourite Good to Great by Jim Collins, the business researcher. One of the points he says in that book is that leaders should prioritise getting the right people on the bus and then figure out where to drive the bus. Is he right in putting the selection of people before strategy, do you think?
It's a funny thing because often you inherit a business that's already in motion. The bus is already moving. So I think it's a little simplistic to assume that, because often you have certain things imposed upon you by the business you're in, the circumstances it's in, and the existing occupants of the bus, to use the analogy.
Yeah.
But I do take the general point, and I wouldn't have thought this some years ago, that if you get the right people, the right culture, they will establish for the business they're in and the assets they have the right strategy over time. And I would have said the other way around. I said, get the assets, have the right strategy, and then find the people to do the work. But I'm increasingly of the view that you have to have the right people first. And obviously, it's not merely a case of getting a lot of people who have a particular mindset, because then you have that same problem of everyone thinking alike. you do have to make sure they're qualified for the kind of general roles which you envisage they will be serving in. But yes, I do actually think you do need to collect the team, and then you can amend that strategy and modify your execution of that strategy in time.
Yeah. As a NED, and you've been a NED for some years, what have you learned about leadership at the board level, and does it manifest itself differently from leadership at the executive level?
Look, it's very different because you're not nearly as visible. You know, the key fulcrum of the organisation is always the CEO, who's a member of the board, and also the public face of the company and the public leader of the company. So that's the most critical role. And obviously the board selects, retains, occasionally admonishes and guides that leader.
Yep.
But they are, you know, in the end the board selects that person, so that's the critical function. But as a board, you will engage with the staff, you know, on far fewer occasions. So clearly the exposure that you have is much more limited. So you've got to be satisfied that the overall direction of the company is appropriate, that the right people are being employed in the key positions, and you have to sort of get out of the way to a degree. So therefore you're not sitting there every day embedding or reinforcing that culture. But I think you've got to make sure there's absolute non-negotiables built in to the way in which the business operates.
Yeah.
And that's reflected more than anything in the behaviour of the CEO and his team or her team. But you can't be there every day to oversee every interaction. And that's the challenge. You have to somehow take the temperature without being in the room all the time.
Yeah, that's right. The fact that there are many CEOs who also wear the hat of MD, so they sit on the board and lead the executive team. Does that create a dilemma for boards and the chairman of boards? How do they manage that dual relationship?
Well, I think it's appropriate in a lot of ways because you expect every other executive to be both a member of a team and a leader of a team. And that's what you're asking the MD to do. So it avoids the situation where the CEO has no sense of contributing to or directing the company's strategy. But equally, it makes sure that he's part of a collegial group that actually makes the core decisions. And I think the models whereby the MD is too dominant and, you know, you have a sort of a rubber stamp committee for a board is clearly inappropriate and means you might as well not be there. But equally, the managing director has got to know that he's part of that greater team. There's a degree of comfort and support that he or she can derive from that. But that, you know, there's obviously a set of expectations that goes with him. And equally, if you look at an executive team, you need them to be, cooperative and collegial.
Yeah.
But you also need from time to time as the MD, sometimes you might have to change a member of that team if it's appropriate. So you have this situation where you're a member of the team, but you're also separate from the team. And that's, I think, the relationship you have to have with the MD.
It's a nuanced situation, isn't it? And a fine balancing act in many cases. We're certainly seeing evidence fairly recently of a number of companies whose reputation is being challenged, tarnished by perceived or real lack of integrity. And a lot of people are saying that the unavailability of talented people to join the mining industry and help drive the pipeline of projects and the operations, the shortage of those individuals is more to do with the disengagement from the industry than a physical shortage of skills. In other words, the industry's capacity to grow is being hampered by an image problem or a trust deficit born out of disappointment or suspicions about the integrity of some mining companies. Do you have a view on this? And if you see this happening, is the situation getting worse?
Well, maybe break that down in a couple of sections. Talk about the talent deficit later. The first issue is I think that bad behaviour is in no way confined to the mining industry. I think, unfortunately, inappropriate executive behaviour and inappropriate oversight by boards is a problem that crops up in every industry. And I don't think it's any more prevalent in mining than any other. As for the overall capacity of us to bring on, you know, the right sort of people and bring them up into positions of leadership in the industry, I think in the end that comes down to an overall competition for talent at the lower levels of the business, which ultimately filter their way up into leadership positions. And one of the things that concerns me the most, I suppose, is the fact that the intake of people to come on as professionals who eventually make their way up into the leadership roles seems to be dwindling. And at the same time, we're trying to grow the industry from, at least from my perception, appears to be a waning talent pool at the bottom. So that means you have a problem, which is, by the way, demographically driven. As you know, every country in the Western world has a declining birth rate. Therefore, you've got declining numbers of new professionals to replace those that have gone. So therefore, you've got to compete with every other industry, which is also desperately looking for people to meet its needs. And that's everything from doctors and nurses to builders to plumbers to mining operators. And I think in the end, you have to make the industry attractive. And I think in the past, that hasn't been the case, but it hasn't mattered because there's been a sufficient pool of labour and expertise to meet our needs. And how you make the industry attractive is obviously a long area of discussion. But there's a lot of things at the moment which probably make it unattractive.
You raise a good point. Certainly the tertiary enrolments in disciplines like mining engineering and geology and chemical engineering or metallurgy is on the decline. The institutions are simply not producing enough mining professionals. On the other point of how do you improve the value proposition of the mining industry as opposed to competing with the construction industry, for example? What should mining be doing differently?
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, the first thing is to say our workforce is noticeably lacking in women. It's improved, obviously, but it's way behind other industries. So if you simply tapped more effectively into 50% of the population, you must increase your talent pool. Now, how do you do that? I presume you have to make it a safe place. You have to make it attractive to work in what is often going to be a remote camp. You've got to make sure that the amenities, the training, the career development, the accommodations for people with family obligations are all comparable or better than your peers in other industries. I think you've also got to develop a sense that people who join the industry aren't really doing a job, that there is a career progression. And I can speak to my own experience, which is I've been to every continent on earth. I've done a whole variety of different roles, none of which I would have envisaged when I first just struck out looking for a job. But I think you have to be able to express that opportunity to people, that you're not merely taking on a job in this industry. There's a whole world of opportunities that might arise, sometimes opportunities you can't really foresee. I think the third thing that's not often perhaps stated explicitly enough is that it's a well-paid industry. And at the moment where people are struggling to meet, their cost of living and where you want to be able to, secure a mortgage and maybe have a family, the fact that you can work in the mining industry, you're well-paid, you can buy a house, you can service a mortgage, you can build some wealth, is actually an attractive element. And I'm not sure we actually are as good at promoting that as we could be.
Yeah, you raise good points there. And on the gender diversity topic, certainly in recent years, I think we're improving the gender diversity at the board level, but still not getting as very many female senior executives into the industry. And it would be really good, I think, to have more women running mining businesses.
And again, that means attracting them at the bottom of the business into the mining discipline. So you need women to study geology and to study metallurgy, or the disciplines that specifically will lead you into mine site leadership roles, and therefore make you, eminently well equipped to take on, corporate leadership roles. And it does mean that there's certain streams which the portion of women is much lower. Certain disciplines, I should say, are much lower in our industry than maybe their equivalents in other industries.
And now we take a short break to acknowledge our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Halo Civil Engineering. Halo is a multidiscipline civil contractor that specialises in the delivery of complex civil projects across defence, infrastructure, energy and resources. A West Australian company committed to delivering dynamic solutions with a focus on zero harm, while having a positive impact on their industry, clients and the people they serve. For more information, search for Halo Civil Engineering on socials or visit halocivil.com. If you'd like to inquire about sponsoring an episode of Hearts and Minds, please reach out to us on LinkedIn or via email info@ivyandgecko.com.au. Ivy and Gecko is a leading Australian talent and organisational consulting firm. We specialise in providing executive search and board consulting services to ASX small and mid-tier explorers, developers and producers in the gold and critical minerals industries. As the only executive search and leadership consulting firm to be admitted membership of the Minerals Council of Australia, Ivy and Gecko is uniquely resourced to advocate for the interests of our exploration, project development and mining clients.
Let's focus on culture development within a mining business. Who's responsible for culture, Dave, and what are the indications of a healthy corporate culture?
Like, I think the implementation of the culture, the leadership and the representation and the personification of the culture always comes from the CEO, the CFO.
Yep.
There are those who'd say the absence of personality comes from the CFO, but I would say that. No, that comes from the CEO, but they're obviously empowered to do so by the board, and the board has a set of expectations. And so I think a healthy culture is one in which you can see the way in which the interactions between and amongst the whole team is comparable to what you would expect to see at the board. And so you can sense that there's a single unified culture. The challenge always is when you've got sites, and we've now got, in the case of Westgold, several operating sites. You obviously want to make sure there's a reasonable representation of that culture on all of those places, and that the basic values are being replicated. And I think the only way you can do that is that executive, once you're comfortable and confident that they're representing things properly, that they're very visible. And I guess that's one of the comforts we take at Westgold, is that the management team led by Wayne are very visible on the sites. They're out there all the time, and hopefully they're, and I believe they are, representing the sort of culture that we want to propagate throughout the whole business.
Is it a complication to a business that acquires another company's assets that you do have a number of subcultures existing? Is that something that the company should tolerate, or is there a need to integrate it into one culture?
There's a need to integrate it into one culture without pursuing mindless uniformity. People are individuals, and there's obviously going to be different personalities expressed in any organisation, but there's some sort of core modes of operation that we encourage and others that we discourage. What I would say is that we did obviously a very substantial transaction acquiring Karora, but one of the things that made it much easier is that right at the onset, we met all of their team, and there was the outgoing board management expressed a lot of confidence in the fact that there was a compatible culture into which they were entrusting their people. So the view was that it would be easy to proceed with the transaction for that, amongst other reasons. There's also compatibility between the assets and the skill sets, etc. But because they felt that, and we felt as well, that it was actually a culturally comparable organisation, and that, as far as I'm aware, has proved to be the case. And the integration of those assets has gone about as well as I think it needs to be expected to.
Yeah, great. I mean, acquisitions are all about synergy, aren't they? So you're hoping that 2 + 2 equals something more than 4 when two businesses or a group of assets come together. It seems to me, as a consultant looking in, that very often executives and boards pay a lot of attention to the physical assets, the mines, process plants, infrastructure, as they should, but perhaps pay less attention to the less tangible aspects of a merger in the processes, the systems, the people, the culture. So it often seems to me that perhaps people with a people and culture background or an HR background would be valuable at the board level in overseeing and providing insight into how those less tangible aspects of a merger do come together to provide added value.
Look, I'm sure that's true. And when we had an integration committee for the transaction, and I was the board representative on that. Now, I lack an HR background, as you know, David. But one of the things that strikes me as most obvious is you'll have a Gantt chart of 1,000 tasks to do. But there's probably only 2 that really matter. Number one is making sure the people know what they're doing, who's in their team, what their title is, who they report to, and what the conditions of their employment are, and that they can be satisfied that their position is been hopefully enhanced and certainly not reduced by the transaction. That's number one. Number 2 is you just have to get grips with the operations and how they're currently functioning. Everything else is kind of secondary, your accounting system and how it. The CFO, again, will probably curse me for saying this, but I don't think it matters that much. You'll eventually get there, and in the end, there are ways and means of dealing with those sort of issues, or your purchasing systems, or your management systems, for want of a better word. I think the critical thing is making sure people are happy and comfortable with the new environment, and that over time they get brought into the fold, and that those people who are really critical are feel as though their contribution is acknowledged, and that we understand their value to the new organisation. Even though we've gone through all that process over a 3-month period, and there are many, many tasks which clearly have to be done, I think they're really critical too. What have you bought, and who's going to run it for you and operate it for you, and how do you make sure that they're comfortable with the new regime?
Good point. When I ask executives or NEDs about the key challenges facing the industry today, probably the number one response, Dave, is frustration with approvals processes. It can be navigating the state and the federal agencies and the various regulations can be a very long process, a very expensive one, and a tortuous path to navigate. We're all aware of the McPhillamys project frustration that was experienced by Regis fairly recently. The Minerals Council of Australia has proposed a one-stop shop type of facility where prospective investors into mining projects can go through one doorway and familiarise themselves with an integrated state and federal system. Is that part of the solution to the frustration that many companies are facing in regards to approval processes?
Well, I'm probably got a slightly contrarian view on this, David, and I would even slightly challenge the premise of that question. And look, we can get on to other regimes maybe in a minute, but it's often stated, there's very frustration, and it can be slow and cumbersome and expensive. I would acknowledge that. But you've got a federal system of government. There's a lot of benefits and merit to that. But inevitably, there's going to be some overlap and some inefficiencies. And we should absolutely seek to minimise that. But McPhillamys is very topical, and clearly there's a lot of opinions about the validity of the decision. But I do note that the company has recourse to the courts. It's taken that course. If it turns out the ministers misapplied the law, then presumably they'll get some reward. It will have slowed down and frustrated their process, and I understand that that's a problem. It's not ideal. But if you look at the growth in the minerals industry in the last 25 years, I would say very few projects of genuine financial or operational or technical or environmental merit have failed to proceed. And I used to work obviously in the former life and financing. Most prospective projects die because they're not very good. Because they're financially or environmentally or from other community perspective not going to work. And in fact, the government doesn't kill them. The people that would be ordinarily obliged to fund them do.
That's right. I understand that something like 5% of projects progress from feasibility stage through to financial investment.
And, you can't blame the government for that. And interesting enough, if you look at the demand for the materials that are produced in this country, it's not going to diminish or go away. Everything that we consume as human beings is mined or farmed or caught. And so there's always going to be a demand for our products. You also have in Australia the good fortune to have, in a lot of cases, not too many competing land uses. So most things that can and should be mined because there's a demand for that product are. And we're both old enough to remember the 90s, right? When the Wick and Mabo decisions were going to destroy the Australian mining industry. And there was a lot of, dare I say, Chicken Little discussion. And it turned out not to be the case because clearly it's such a valuable industry to Australia and there's such demand and necessity for the products to be produced here that if you find a way of accommodating these other needs, whether they're environmental or native title. So I am a bit more of an optimist maybe about this stuff. That is not to say that there should not be a constant kind of effort to achieve efficiencies and avoid duplications most of all. I think that's always regrettable if you've got to go through the same gate more than once.
Let's touch on the complexity of doing business in overseas jurisdictions. I'm thinking particularly some countries in Africa. Dave, you've been there as an executive, and it's fairly topical that we're seeing some tension in Mali with some executives of Resolute Mining. Do you have a viewpoint on what's going on there?
Well, first of all, it's really alarming, and obviously know some of the individuals involved in that particular situation, and I'm obviously hopeful and expectant they'll be released, but it's a completely unacceptable course of events for someone to go about their lawful business and be detained for whatever reason. And it does unfortunately speak to, I think, the deterioration in the situation in Mali over the last several years. Clearly what we've got is a military junta
Yes.
In control of the country. They, like every authoritarian government, generally stifle industry and entrepreneurship in the country. So therefore they're desperate for money.
Yes.
And the means by which they acquired power at the point of a gun is now the means by which they seek to raise revenue. It's incredibly disappointing.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Challenging.
That's right. I mean, the irony is that they're desperate for money, but doing what they've done is no incentive for other companies to invest.
Would anyone go and explore in Mali right now, despite the fact that it is probably one of the most prospective countries in West Africa? If you look at the West Mali along the border with Senegal, it is the most productive part of West Africa for gold production at present. Yet those existing operations are unlikely to be replaced by new discoveries unless there's an incentive or comfort for companies to go and explore there. So, and I feel really bad for the people of Mali because I really enjoyed going there and I enjoyed meeting them all. And you feel as though they are going to be the victims of this. In the end, Western companies can take their investment elsewhere. There might be a few disgruntled shareholders, but to be really honest, they can afford it.
Yes.
But a country which is on the global Human Development Index, right near the bottom.
Yes.
And for which mining is such a vital source of national revenue that hopefully pays for schools and hospitals and roads and infrastructure. If you denude the country of that industry, then you only impoverish the people. So it's, that in that respect, it's not merely incredibly unfortunate and unpleasant for the individuals involved. It's somewhat tragic for the country.
Yeah, indeed. Yes.
So that's my feeling about it all. I mean, but it also places the issue of sovereign risk and, maybe slightly clunky approvals processes in Australia in some context.
Yes. Yeah. We're not too bad, are we, over here?
And every survey of these things shows Australia and Western Australia in particular as being right at the top of competitive rankings for that reason.
Correct. Yeah. Some good insights. Dave, I haven't prepared you for the next section, but I'd like to play a word association game with you. So I'm about to make a statement and I'd like you to give me, if you can, a one-word response to what I'm about to say. The first one, the biggest risk for Australian miners in 2026?
Access to skilled staff. Oh, one word, sorry. Staff.
Staff, okay. The future impact of AI in the mining industry?
Unpredictable.
King Charles III as Australia's head of state?
I'm trying to think of one word. Remarkable.
Snoop Dogg?
Genius.
The general quality of governance of Australian mining boards?
Variable.
The state of diversity within mining executive teams?
Improving.
The likelihood of the Fremantle Dockers ever winning an AFL premiership?
See my answer for King Charles. No. Certain.
The prospect of the ALP forming government after the next federal election?
Possible.
And finally, the likelihood of Australia achieving its target of 82% renewable electricity generation by 2030?
Challenging.
Okay, good. Let's close our conversation with some rapid-fire questions. When you think about people who've shown great leadership in business, sport or the creative arts, who do you most admire?
It's a funny one. I am never a great believer in putting people onto pedestals because people are flawed and we're all got our limitations and our shortcomings. I think the people whom I admire the most probably aren't necessarily publicly particularly notable. And often those that make themselves publicly notable maybe have leadership qualities that I don't necessarily admire as much.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to answer your question by giving you a specific name because, I am sort of always drawn to people who are maybe less voluble and...
that's an interesting and good response. What's the best career advice or business advice you've ever been offered?
Well, it wasn't offered to me specifically. It's a very famous quote by Warren Buffett, which is never invest in anything you don't understand.
Yes.
I'm paraphrasing here.
Yeah.
When you take a job, you're investing the most valuable thing you have, which is most of your energy, a lot of your time, and, 60% of your waking hours. So I always think, do your research. We should make a major purchase. If you make any significant life decision, make sure you understand what you're doing. And I think it's a really good sage advice. It seems obvious, right? But there's an old expression, marry in haste, repent at leisure. And I think you need to take on a job or a career or, particularly if you want to make a big change in your life, just make sure that you've thought it through. And because you are making the biggest investment of all, which is your own energy and time.
Yeah. You mentioned Warren Buffett. You'd be aware then of Charlie Munger, his lieutenant and long-time vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway. Charlie died last year at the age of 99, and I read that in his last interview, he was asked the question, during your 70-odd year career in business, what's the most important thing you've learned? And Charlie said that trust is the most powerful economic force on earth. I found that really interesting and reinforces, doesn't it, the importance of trust as a foundation of all transactions and all strategy in life. Without people trusting each other, we have very fragile foundations.
And that's true. And in fact, you can't legislate or regulate every interaction, business or human. You have to take people at face value. So trust but verify, as they say. But I think in the order course of events, there's no banking system without trust.
Yes.
You've got to assume that your money's going into a bank account and they're not going to throw it away. And without a banking system, even though everyone despises banks, there's no coherent economic entity in any country.
You mentioned you're a reader. What is a non-fiction book that you found very valuable?
Well, it's interesting. I would read 100 fiction books for every one non-fiction book I read. I don't read a lot of fiction. I do a lot of browsing of information. But there was a book I've got on my shelf, which is written by a guy called Bill Bryson, travel author, called A Brief History of the Universe.
I've heard of it.
I like that because my family will tell you this, I'm a bit like my father. I like to think I know everything. And I quite like a book that is an attempt to express everything. And I actually found it quite interesting.
It's a classic. I haven't read it, but I've certainly heard it and seen it in the bookshops.
And I haven't read it for some years, so I might even go back and revisit it. But I think for someone who's interested in everything and knows not much about anything, it's a great book.
Yeah. What have you changed your mind about recently?
Brussels sprouts. Wasn't a fan, but now I'm a big fan. But
Very healthy for you too.
I cannot do kale under any circumstances.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a sprouts man myself. What will you never change your mind about?
Oh, I've got no idea actually, because I change my mind very slowly. But it's amazing how often you'll look back and find you have changed your mind. Well, I never changed my mind about. It's a very good question.
We might come back to that.
Come back. I'm supposed to have prepared an answer, haven't I?
No, look, I don't think I prepped you for that question, nor did I this one. What's one thing that you should start doing?
Me personally? Oh, look, I think at my age, the worst thing you can do is look back and assume that it's all over. I think you've got to keep moving, and I think one of the things you do have to do, I'm past the point where, I'm working to fund a family and all of that stuff. And I suppose I've reached a happy position where I'm not kind of working for my own short-term financial need. So you've got to find a purpose in life and make sure you're doing something worthwhile and useful. And I think that's the one thing for someone like me to do, is to make sure that whatever you're doing, whatever your purpose in life is, you give yourself to that. And you identified what that is.
Yeah.
And it's funny, when you come towards the end of your full-time working life, you have to actually reassess, your immediate purpose.
Yeah.
If you don't, then what are you going to do, right?
That's right, and probably fair to say that during your whole life you reach milestone points where you reassess
Correct.
What you're here for, and what value you have to offer.
One of the things being, when your working life is now extended to sort of 40 years, plus your school, plus your university, it's sort of 50-odd years of always knowing on a Monday morning what you have to do.
Yeah.
And having the sort of a purpose and a task in life. Yeah. And one of the things is to make sure that you are still purposeful when that necessity has diminished.
Yeah, indeed. Final question, Dave. What advice would you give your younger self to help you live a better quality life?
I think probably to maybe take a few little risks here and there that maybe I would have been reluctant to in hindsight. Having said that, when I look back on my life, I've done a lot of things that I would never in my widest expectations done. And some of those have been slightly risky. But I think sometimes you have to take little steps that are slightly discomforting and maybe take a few more than you're completely comfortable with.
Great. Dave Kelly, we've learned a bit about you personally and professionally. We've gained some insight into your philosophy about business and about the mining industry. Thanks very much for being our guest on Hearts and Minds today.
My pleasure. Thanks, David.
Thanks for tuning in to Hearts and Minds. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a rating or share it with a friend. And don't forget to follow us and connect on social media for updates on all of our upcoming guests. I'm Alana Bray-White, and I look forward to you joining us for our next episode.